Right, let's go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, Making the Case for Channel Diversification. For those who aren't familiar with Right Side Up, we're a collective of marketing specialists who have helped more than 1,000 companies hit their growth goals. So we have expertise across all areas of marketing from performance, life cycle, SEO, social analytics, just to name a few. However, by designing the right strategies and deploying the right talent from freelancers to fractional leaders to FTEs to custom-based agency teams, we really empower companies of all stages and sizes to help them grow. But enough about us. Let's go ahead and introduce today's speaker. So I am thrilled to be joined by Tyler Elliston, our founder of Right Side Up. He is a performance marketer by trade. He has helped many organizations from early stage to enterprise organizations really help them grow. And as I mentioned before, he resides in Austin, Texas, and he has an MBA from UC Berkeley. So we're really thrilled to have Tyler, our founder, on, but I'll let him do kind of a formal intro in a little bit. All right, let's get through these housekeeping items. So please note all participants except the panelists are muted. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. We'll have a Q&A kind of at the end of the webinar, so we'll answer as many questions as we can. And if we can't get to everything, we will reach out individually to answer. And then lastly, an email with the recording will be sent out tomorrow. So if you want to rewatch the webinar or share it with any colleagues, just look out for the recording in your inbox. All right, so it is poll time. So before I hand it off to Tyler, we're going to launch a quick poll. So what is the biggest challenge you face in diversifying your media mix? Is it getting budget approval? Is it buy-in on tracking or measuring success? Is it ROI constraints? Or is it team bandwidth, or you just don't have the channel-specific expertise? So it looks like we're getting kind of a mix, actually. We'll just give it a couple more seconds, and then we will share the results. Tyler, are you surprised by any of these results?
No, not yet. It is a good mix. And I think that's quite common. It's one of the reasons that diversification is hard, because it's hard in many levels. Like there are a lot of challenges to overcome.
Very true. All right, let's close this poll and share the results. Cool. So it looks like we got kind of a mix across the drawing board, but it looks like team bandwidth or just don't have the channel specific expertise is the winner. And no one had other. So it looks like those four kind of are the key challenges.
Awesome. That's really helpful. And we can kind of incorporate these results a little bit in some of the slides a little bit later. First off, Amanda, thank you for organizing this. Really appreciate it. And I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's one of my favorites. Just for those who have joined, thank you for taking your time. We know that your time is valuable. Hopefully this will prove useful and worthwhile. My background, as Amanda said, by training is as a performance marketer. I ran growth for performance marketing for Eventbrite, and then held a number of VP marketing roles where I was really focused on performance marketing and analytics. And so, that's sort of the first lens that I bring to this topic. The other lens is Right Side Up. So over the last 8 years, we've talked with literally thousands of companies, and we've asked these sorts of questions like, what channels are working for you? Which channels did you test first? What channels are you looking to next? And did that one work? And did this one work? And so, across those conversations, we've had the opportunity to pattern match, the most common starting places, the most common, the contexts in which diversification typically happens, and then like what channels are typically deployed when companies want to diversify. And so, that's really the sort of lens that I bring to this. There are a handful of topics that we'll cover, and my goal is to run through them pretty quickly, since the interaction will happen more at the end with the Q&A. So I'll try to move relatively quickly through these. But first off, just channel diversification. What are we talking about to make sure we're aligned on what I mean by that? Readiness for diversification, sort of signs that it's a good time to do that. And then once you sort of have the go, no go decision, you say, yes, we're a go. Let's diversify our channel mix. How do you lay the groundwork to do that successfully? And then in the last section, I'm just going to do a quick survey of really the channel landscape, the channels that we see companies using, with a very quick review of like the pros and cons of each. So lots of content there that we'll go through very quickly. So to jump in, there are a handful of quotes that we hear that make us think about channel diversification. First one is our spend is concentrated on Google search and Meta. It's not always true that companies start with these two channels, but the vast majority of the time, they do. They start with one or both of these channels. It's very rare that a company comes to us and says, we're only active in one performance marketing channel, and it's, I don't know, Reddit or whatever it may be. So, we consider Google and Meta to be a little bit of like bellwethers for performance marketing in general. And we feel like if you can't make one of these work, at least historically, if you can't make one of these work, then it's unlikely that you're going to find, really strong, high ROI, scalable success elsewhere. The benefits of diversification, there are many of them. These are a few that we sort of see most commonly. One, obviously, is scale. Two, risk mitigation associated with the channels that you're already in, may need to diversify away from or in addition to. New audiences, specifically getting exposure to people you're not exposed to today, and then greater sophistication. So I'll share a couple of quotes that relate to each one of these. So hopefully you don't relate to this too much. Your CEO says, let's increase new customers 50% next month. Sometimes it feels like whiplash as a performance marketing team, in terms of sort of demand expectations. And the channels that you have today have ceilings, right? And so, being able to see around the bend, so to speak, on how much demand is going to be asked of you, and to then have the channels available and the audience available to then hit those numbers. So this is one, obviously scale. Diversification helps answer this question or respond to this. When you see in the news, Facebook CPMs increased 30%. Actually, you wouldn't need to look in the news. Like, you would probably see that in your account first. But Facebook CPMs increased 30% last month, or the targeting dimensions, X particular dimension will no longer be available, or companies are pulling ad dollars from whatever platform. Like, these are all major risks to having really focused spend in one or two channels. Primarily, I'm talking about Meta. The targeting dimensions going away. I mean, Cambridge Analytica was sort of the first big shift, and then there have been a number since where, there were companies that were spending 70% of their marketing budget, driving 70% of their sales or leads or customers through Facebook, that when the targeting goes away or is diminished, it fundamentally changes the course of their business. And then they're scrambling to diversify their channel mix. And it's very, very hard to be successful really, really quickly. So these are a couple of sort of scary cues that point to diversification. Sometimes a CEO or CMO will say, great, we're getting these customers, but we need different customers, that are a different age demographic or a different, a different step in the stage in the funnel. That's a big one as well. Paid search is obviously very, very bottom funnel. Facebook, you can use it for every stage of the funnel, but most companies that are using it as sort of one of their first two channels are typically using it as a bottom to mid funnel channel. And so invariably, companies come to this point where they need to move up funnel. They need to reach different audiences, and sometimes additional channels are really critical to making that happen. Last quote or set of quotes, CFO questions. Gosh, Jane, like, how do you reconcile click-throughs and view-throughs? Or, hey, John, how do you attribute conversions across mini and offline touch points? And how do we properly test incrementality? A lot of these questions are, some of them are applicable within Facebook and Google with scale. So testing incrementality, for example, you don't need to diversify to do that. But some of the others are around multi-touch attribution and click-throughs versus view-throughs really come into focus when you are touching prospects with a lot of channels, and especially when you start using channels that are much more view-through centric. Obviously, there's a view-through element of for Facebook, but a lot of companies honestly discount them so heavily that you can get to positive ROI without considering them. There are a lot of other channels that like they just don't work if you don't consider view throughs and sort of have a methodology. And so that is a benefit of diversification. It sort of pushes you towards this sophistication as a marketing organization and cross-functionally, which will basically be the foundation for like really scaling your spend and revenue. Okay, so moving on to the next topic, readiness for diversification. So you might be ready if there are a few of them here. You have quote unquote good ROAS in Google and or Meta spending greater than $100,000 a month. Um, Obviously, this is not a fixed thing. It might make sense, earlier or later, but generally speaking, um, we will be concerned if a company comes to us and says, "Hey, we want to diversify into 3 more channels," and we say, "Okay, how much are you spending on Google and Meta?" And they say 10K in each or 15K in each, and we say, "Okay, can you spend more, or what happens when you spend more?" And either they can't because they're so tight in the targeting, or the ROAS is not good enough when they start spending more. That's generally a sign that you're not ready for diversification. The reason for that, as I mentioned earlier, Google and Meta are generally bellwethers for these channels. They're generally bottom funnel or close to bottom funnel. And so when you start diversifying channels, you might find a pocket of spend where the ROI is better, but you are unlikely to find a large scalable audience that you can hit repeatedly and get meaningfully better ROAS than you're going to get from Google or Meta. So it's just a really good benchmark that we generally consider a prerequisite of sorts. You might be ready if your successful channels are showing signs of diminishing returns or you expect them to. We always like to see um, teams or account managers testing the limits of scalability within their accounts to say, okay, we might not be ready to spend this, every day of the month, but for one day this month, let's see if we can maintain, our historic ROAS and spend double or spend triple, and just understand sort of the elasticity of that curve, so that you can then beware when the CEO says, okay, we need 50% more conversions next week or next month or next quarter. You know how much headroom you have in the channels that you're already running successfully. You might be ready if your successful channels have specific headwinds. So, for example, a potential US ban. Speaking of TikTok, TikTok we'll talk about later, but it certainly has emerged as a really compelling paid social channel for a lot of companies. There are some companies that are even starting with TikTok. But goodness, if that's your only channel, like this is a big threat. Depending on, what percentage of your sort of total revenue is coming from performance marketing. And then diminishing targeting. So, the example I mentioned earlier of Meta, where, if 70% of your revenue is coming from performance marketing and, 70 to 100% of your performance marketing is on Meta, then yeah, when targeting goes away, it can be really, really harmful. We saw that when, when a lot of sort of the income and net worth targeting went away, or was diminished. And companies that were specifically targeting like high net worth individuals, yes, there are proxies and workarounds, but that's one example of just really painful sort of capability reductions. You might be ready if media buying is a primary acquisition lever. So, it's one thing if your performance marketing is driving 10% of your total revenue and you have really good, partnerships and BD, or on the B2B side, sales, or just organic growth. If 10% is from performance marketing, it takes a little bit of the pressure off in terms of like how aggressively to diversify your channels. On the other hand, if it's the vast majority of your marketing muscle and you have really aggressive growth goals, then all the more important to be testing channels when you don't have to have that audience, so that when you do have to have the audience, you've already proven your way through it. One warning, just to kind of wrap up this little subsection. Um, if you do not have an early channel that is producing good ROI, that is not a cue to diversify your media mix. I say this from experience. So, um, I was involved with a company at one point in a marketing role where we really did not have product market fit, but we thought we did. And we tested everything. Like, we tested every channel, and honestly, like, nothing worked. And it was so frustrating. And it wasn't until, ultimately after the business failed, that I and others realized, like, okay, ultimately that was not a marketing problem. And I wish that, and hopefully I could have heard this feedback in that moment. I wish that somebody had come alongside me and said, look, you do not have product market fit. This is not a marketing challenge. It's a product one. And so that's one of the things that I and we try really hard to do, is when a company comes to us and says this, hey, we want to spin up a bunch of money in X channel because nothing is working for us. It doesn't mean for a fact they don't have product. We want to take a really close look at that. It may also be that the ROI standard is too high. Um, it's become really common or fashionable for ROAS to be treated as a KPI that, more is better, which on one level, I can see that perspective. On the other hand, if you're a company saying, okay, we demand a 10-to-1 ROI to LTV ratio, then you're not going to be able to spend. Or if that doesn't sound extreme enough, 20-to-1 or 30. At some threshold, you just can't actually spin in the channel because it won't work. And certainly if you can't get one channel to work for 50 to 100K, then diversifying is not going to be successful either. So last comment on aggressiveness. I think I've kind of verbally already talked through this, but the more resources you have and the more risk tolerance you have, the more aggressive you can or should be. If you maybe I'll go with like the risk tolerance. I talked with a CMO one time. This was now probably 6 years ago. They were a very early stage company. They were not spending, over $50,000 in any channel. And that CMO had just strong conviction that TV was the right channel for them and it was going to crush it. And in fact, the whole leadership team had a really high risk tolerance. And he sold this through. And to his credit, TV advertising was incredibly successful for them. And it literally like 4x'd the enterprise value of that business. Now, I'm not recommending that. I'm just using that as an example of, you kind of have to figure out for yourself and for your company and your stage, where are you on this chart? There are certainly very early stage companies that are bootstrapped, that are, founder-led marketing teams, and they are understandably and rightly very slow to diversify their channel mix, and they test into it very gradually. So, the point is not there's a right and wrong, just that it's very nuanced. Okay, so laying the groundwork. So once you decide, yes, I want to diversify my media mix, or diversify it more than I already have to date, there are a few things that we recommend really focusing on before you actually like spin up the channel and start spending. Um, I've only got a few slides here. This is really the big one, and it's around cross-functional buy-in, which obviously was one of our poll questions. One of the biggest is budget. How much money is required to test this channel? The answer to that is really business specific, but you want to get a really meaningful number of conversions through so that you can get a CAC figure that is statistically significant. right? The one of the worst outcomes of a diversification test is to get a false negative because you didn't spend enough, or moving to the next one, you didn't give it enough time. And I do think a lot of I shouldn't say marketing organizations, a lot of CEOs and boards um, have come to expect sort of what you get from paid search and paid social, which is this very immediate feedback loop. And while you might not be able to prove the channel totally in, say, a month, you can get really fast reads. And it's like, okay, yeah, it's not statistically significant, but have we gotten conversions and what's the CAC? And you can kind of see it unfolding. That's not true for a lot of other channels. So like take podcast advertising, for example, or radio. Like you've got to do so many drops over so much time. There's with podcasts, there's delayed consumption, right? Where they may not download it for a month where the ad is embedded, or they might download it but not listen to it. So there's a real delay. And so we've seen this a lot with our podcast advertising group that does great work. But just many, many examples of especially CEOs saying, "Oh, I think we should stop this," like 4 weeks in or 6 weeks in, because 4 or 6 weeks in to a meta test, you can get a pretty good read. 4 to 6 weeks into a podcast test, it's really tough. And, we routinely say, no, 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 wait, we've got to go through the whole flight. We've got to go through the whole flight. And not every time, but the vast majority of the time, once we get to the end of the period, it's about what we expected, or better. So timeline is a big one. Attribution. So tracking. This was the biggest number in our poll response, with 38% buy-in on tracking or measuring success, which also speaks to ROAS at the end of this row. But um, you know, as you move up funnel, you've got to consider view through conversions, and you've got to consider offline interactions, specifically for like podcast, radio, and TV. And so, while we could certainly have a very robust talk about sort of what that conversation should look like, I think right now, suffice to say that often there's misalignment coming out of Google and Facebook. There's often misalignment with finance teams and sometimes CEOs with how robust the data is going to be, how much of a science it's going to be versus an art, how much you'll have to rely on multiple sources versus one source. Um, and we see a lot of tests fail, and not to be overly negative, but we also see a lot of marketers sort of lose confidence. Leadership teams lose confidence in their marketing leader because once you start the test, then it's hard for them to not think that you're arguing for different attribution or tracking because the results are not good. And so it's really important to lay that foundation and get alignment before there's any media out there, and to really get their buy-in on the methodology. It's not just like, oh, here's an FYI, here's how we're going to do it, but like really explaining it and have them understand why you can't, just look at clicks, or why you have to do a how did you hear about a survey. Like that's so 2005, which it is, even though it's for many channels, like it's actually best in class still. Moving on. So nurturing, this one is really, I mean, it's applicable to all businesses, but especially applicable to B2B. We often see companies where the sales cycle is not immediate, and sort of the longer the sales cycle is, the more this point holds. Um, when you get somebody through non-brand paid search, almost by definition, they are close to the point of conversion. They're they are not going to take as long as channels acquired through sort of, mid funnel or certainly upper funnel. And so what that means is that you can acquire the right person through paid media, but if you don't have a smart way to nurture them, then then they won't convert. And that's not the problem of the media. That's the problem of the nurturing, sort of the life cycle. And so we commonly see companies have, I'll call it like an undeveloped nurture muscle when you really spend a long time at the very bottom of the funnel. So I would put any of these nurture practices in place before you go out and start spending money. And the higher in the funnel you're going to test into, the more important this point becomes. And then lastly, ROAS. I already touched on this, but I think there are a couple points I would make here. One is that as you move up funnel, as you move away from, the most core customers that you're trying to reach, generally ROAS is the return is going to go down. The cost is going to go up to acquire those people. And it's really important that you have buy-in on that cross-functionally. If you dial in a really tight ROAS constraint in paid search, and that is the standard for your channel diversification, it is very likely your channel diversification is going to fail. So how do you do that? The most effective guidance I can give broadly is to work with finance teams on identifying a specific ROAS that is good but not too good, and articulating what too good really means. And what I mean by too good is it means you're leaving customers on the table that you actually do want. Like if your standard is a 5-to-1, ROI, excuse me, I said it backwards earlier, LTV to ROI ratio. If that's your standard, then I would ask my CFO, like, why don't we want the 4-to-1? Why don't we want the 3-to-1? Like those are really profitable, right? And obviously it depends on how LTV gets calculated and how the return is calculated. But if those are really profitable customers, even on a 6-month value or a 12-month value, as the growth marketer, I would be advocating like, hey, let's not have too much ROI either if growth is our mandate, because growth and the efficiency are opposing forces, right? So if we want more growth, then let's treat ROAS as a constraint, but we really want to spend up to the constraint. We don't want our ROAS to be way higher than our constraint, if that makes sense. Jump in with questions if anyone wants to dive into that in more detail. Okay, this touches on another poll question. We always recommend to determine the best person or people to lead channel diversification, which really depends on which channels you're testing into. Criteria here, we could argue many points, but these are the three that I would generally highlight as probably most important. One is a specialist in the channel. We see a lot of tests fail because a company or team says, well, I have a great person, and no, she doesn't have experience in TikTok, but she's great in Meta, and they're both paid social, and like she's great at figuring things out. Maybe awesome in general, but if you want to make sure you don't get a false negative and you want to do it as efficiently as possible, we always recommend a specialist, whether that be internal, fractional, consultant, agency, doesn't matter. Just get a specialist. Curiosity, this is one where it's very different than sort of inheriting a program and sort of just farming it and trying to make it a little more efficient. Like, no, like we're looking for a hunter. We're looking for a hunter that is like, okay, how do I find ROI here? What creative things, could I do? And fundamentally, how does this channel work? And so, one of the traits that we like the most in performance marketers is people that are so curious, they just sort of deconstruct how things work. It's almost like an engineering mindset. They deconstruct it so then they can reconstruct it for the benefit of of their company, promoting their product or service. And then lastly, data driven, which I think is self-explanatory and pretty common. Last point on this topic, building a test plan. So this is something that we recommend, one, to drive one, to make sure that you actually think through everything you need to think through just by putting it on paper. Secondly, to drive alignment both within a marketing org but also cross-functionally. So I would go back to all those cross-functional points that we highlighted before. I would recommend putting them in writing, putting a test plan in front of the CFO or in front of the CEO, detailing exactly how it'll be tracked and the timeline and everything, the success metrics, so that your team is on the hook for the execution, but really everything else has already been agreed to going into it. All right, last section. I think we're doing pretty well on time. I'm going to run through these really quickly, and feel free to put in a question on a particular channel if you have it. Okay. SEM and Meta are the first ones I'll start with. SEM remains a great channel. It has great intent, great targeting. It's easy to track, and it has moderate to good scale. However, it's pretty expensive at this point, and especially in some categories, which possibly partially offsets the positive. That's why the value on the far right is not great, but it's generally still a good target for most companies where there is intent in search. Meta. So, I had to knock some bars off this since I originally put together these slides. I don't know, probably a year or two ago. Meta still has good targeting, and they're still really good at algorithmically sort of um, um, uh, perceiving intent. To me, that is the magic of Meta. People are not raising their hand saying, "I want this product," and yet um, they are very good at showing people your ads who have a propensity to click and convert. That's really hard to do algorithmically, and Meta did it. And I think that's sort of the magic of the channel and why it took off the way it did. However, tracking has gotten a lot harder. It's become a lot more of a black box, and a lot of the targeting has been reduced. So it is still, to be clear, for the vast majority of our clients, it is still a meaningful part of their media mix. But the percentage of their advertising dollars that are going to Meta has come down significantly over recent years. I'll go through the rest even quicker. TikTok is definitely pulling demand from Meta. We see this a lot. 2 years ago, I would not have recommended it. I would have said it's great at driving impressions, cheap impressions, but they don't convert. That has changed. We now work with a lot of companies that are spending $100,000 to $300,000 a month, and they're doing it in a very direct response way, and the ROI is matching Facebook for some, not all brands. So frankly, I'm very impressed at how they've sort of turned that into a viable direct response channel over recent years. Podcast is great. It's great for generating intent. So this probably goes without saying, but the way that it works, the magic of the channel is endorsement. And endorsement is sort of, in my view, having a moment across all channels. Like the best creative is endorsement, third party or influencer or customers, right? Endorsement via affiliate and endorsement via host reads on podcast. It is less precise in the targeting, so it's best like with national scale products that have national scale and appeal. It does require sophisticated attribution, and what I alluded to earlier. It's like kind of sophisticated, kind of not. Like we're talking about how did you hear about us surveys and triangulating sort of what we can track through URLs and vanity URLs and like promo code links, but that did, those never capture the full demand. So you've got to have a methodology that includes view throughs, which is again kind of going back to the basics of like asking customers post purchase, like, how did you hear about us, and seeing how many people say podcast. Conversion rates do tend to be high. I like sharing this example. There was one time I was in the Google Analytics account for a client where we were running podcast ads, and I looked at the landing page where we were sending traffic from the podcast ads, and I looked at the conversion rate from entrances on that landing page to the site-wide conversion rate, and it was like 6x. I was like, man, that just blows my mind. And I think that speaks to the value, when you get a host who has followers who really trust what they say. When they say, gosh, this mattress is the best, or gosh, this toothbrush just blows my mind, or whatever it is, people will go try it that would not have otherwise had any intent to go buy that product, which is pretty amazing. Radio, similar to podcasts, even greater scale, #1 reach medium in the US. It's great for awareness. There's very little intent due to how broad it is. And then the sort of way you execute it is really important. Linear TV, very much the same, little intent, little targeting, but massive, massive scale. It does require a really substantial, production investment. Certainly that's come down in recent years. It doesn't cost $1 million, doesn't even have to cost you $500,000, but it is definitely a really meaningful investment to test into it right. And again, you really don't want to test into it so cheaply that you wonder at the end, like, oh, that didn't work. But is that because our creative was done for 25K? You definitely don't want to be in that position. Um, OTT, CTV, I'm going to move pretty quickly through these. Um, yes, so I would generally say this is a very common diversification channel, along with some of the others we've talked about. Big screen video messaging, but digital style targeting and tracking. So trying to kind of give you the best of both worlds. Definitely recommend an agency to do this. And then you've just got to be really careful on the quality of the customers that you get from it, and just make sure they're monitored, and see if you need to apply a different CAC target to this medium based on the quality that you're getting. And then direct mail. Direct mail it's always been there, and it still works for a lot of brands. Um, I would certainly not recommend it for everybody. Generally speaking, where I recommend it the most is where you can derive intent from the targeting itself. So someone who just moved, that's your audience, someone who just moved. So they need cable. So if you're selling cable, then like, great, you can target it that way. Also very tight geos where hey, within this zip code or within this neighborhood, everyone there is going to need um, a primary care physician, and we're a new primary care model. Like that totally makes sense. And when it does work, it offers really good scale at reasonable cost. Affiliate, I mentioned them before in the context of endorsement. It's funny, and affiliate had like a heyday in the early, the 2000s, and then the early, 2010s, and it sort of fell out of favor, I think, because so much of affiliate marketing was not incremental. So much of it was just like coupons, and it just felt like everything was siphoning off what you were already getting. Um, that is not the case right now. Like affiliate and sort of like partnership marketing is similarly like having a moment. I like to say, and it's always been pay for performance, but that is one of the key things about it that still makes it really appealing. You can basically fill marketing gaps in your team that you don't want to do internally. There's basically an affiliate for any sort of medium. The ones that we tend to recommend the most are affiliates that have access to the audience that you're looking for already, because that's a reasonable proxy for incrementality, which is kind of our primary consideration, one of our primary considerations with affiliate. Influencer, I would now say this is not a channel, it's like a category of endorsement. Um, you know, yes, you can do pure play influencer buys through marketplaces or direct, but also influencer works really well as creative on TikTok and Meta. An influencer podcast is a flavor of influencer. An affiliate is a flavor of influencer. So I, at least for me, my thinking is sort of taking influencer out of sort of a channel context and more to um, like an asset. Like this is an asset that can be applied to a variety of channels. And it's similarly like just for a lot of brands having a moment, and sometimes a centerpiece of an acquisition strategy. Other channels I want to touch on very briefly, and then we'll wrap up and take questions. Pinterest, Twitter, and native content. There are businesses that these work for them, but they rarely scale. And for most businesses, they don't work. Not to be a downer, but for direct response, we just, if I talk to 100 companies, fewer than 5 are going to say, man, native content is like really crushing it for us with any kind of scale. Same for Twitter and Pinterest. Snapchat, we saw Snapchat work pretty well for e-commerce brands a number of years ago. That has not persisted. So respectfully, I view Snapchat as sort of a fading channel. Not to say that it can't work. And who knows, maybe there will be arbitrage opportunities where, there's an opportunity to sort of buy cheap there, but we do not see a lot of scaled success there. Google Ads, not SEM. I think YouTube has made a lot of progress in recent years. Used to be we would only recommend them for retargeting. Now, in some cases, we'll recommend it for prospecting. GDN, if you want to do programmatic display retargeting, go for it. Prospecting, really tough to prove out incrementality. That goes for both GDN and programmatic display more generally. If you're looking for, measurable incremental conversions, generally, I do not recommend programmatic display. So that's what we have prepared. Why don't we jump into questions?
Yeah, sure. And if you have any questions, now is the time to put them in the Q&A. We have a couple minutes so we can go through a few of these. All right, where should we start? How about Reddit? I know you just mentioned a couple other channels to consider, but what do you think about Reddit as an up and coming channel?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm kind of withholding judgment on it. I mean, there are a lot of companies that are testing into it right now, so it's definitely a hot place to look. I have not spoken with many companies who are have scaled spending there, and by scaled I mean over $100,000 a month. But I wouldn't advise against it. I would treat it as a company, product, situation specific consideration. But especially if you've already tested some of the more proven sort of diversification channels, then I would definitely look at Reddit. I don't know that I would start there if you're like, if you work really hard to get buy-in generally cross-functionally on channel diversification, it feels like potentially a high risk place to start. But I don't dislike it. I'm withholding judgment.
That makes sense. I know we've gotten a ton of TikTok questions as well, so I'm going to try to consolidate a few of these. But one I thought was interesting was, have you, Tyler, and I guess anyone from our Right Side Up team, have we seen any success with any clients that we worked with on TikTok in terms of, clients that have high AOV and long consideration?
Specific to high AOV and consideration cycles, I would need to kind of reach out individually, and we can like look for specific examples. But generally, the general answer to the question is yes. We have many clients that are spending significantly on TikTok, ROI positive, primarily consumer products, not B2B, and typically, younger demographics where sort of the creative can feel native-ish in the channel. So I can't say with confidence specifically long sales cycles, but email and we can dig in with the team and look specifically for examples or a lack thereof.
Sure. All right. Just see a question coming in through the chat, which I think is interesting from Janet. She asked if you can touch on B2B, any channels that you think are better for that, thoughts on LinkedIn ads using your 5 considerations or content syndication.
LinkedIn is, I would also consider it a channel on the rise, but much more slowly than like TikTok, for example. The main reason being CPMs are just so dang high on LinkedIn. So it's always been a really, really expensive channel. I mean, as an outside observer, I've just thought, man, why are they like they need adoption? Why is it so cost prohibitive on the CPM side? But it is working for many brands when when your audience is there, particularly like content consuming audiences. Like we work with many clients that are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on LinkedIn profitably in a direct response way. So I like it. It would definitely be in the like towards the top of the consideration set on the B2B side. But just as an aside, one of the nice things about Facebook over the years was that it worked for so many kinds of companies. You know what I mean? Like if 10 companies were like, I want to diversify my media mix off of paid search, like chances are like 7 of them could make Facebook work. Like it just worked for a lot of companies. And so that's one of the sort of metrics I look for in sort of channel selection. And like going back to Reddit, it might work for some brands, but if 10 try it, am I convinced 7 are going to find success? No, I would consider it a good thing if 3 find success. I think LinkedIn is somewhere in the middle. Um, it's certainly not a like everybody wins when they test into it, but certainly some do. So I think a thoughtful evaluation of it definitely makes sense. Um, Outside of LinkedIn on the B2B side, affiliate has always been and continues to be a meaningful channel, as painful as that is on the B2B side. Sort of just paying for leads for best software in X industry. And it's like, oh, they would have landed on our site, but they went to a comparison page. So it's painful to to pay that, but that environment is thriving. Outside of that, I don't think there are any B2B specific channels that I would highlight. Though many of the B2C channels also work. So like, podcasts, for example, like there are really big B2B advertisers in podcasts. Obviously depends on sort of the specific audience you're trying to reach and how broad it is.
Exactly. And to Janet, to your point, I agree. I know LinkedIn is key. If you are trying to target like a specific audience or a job title, things like that, Facebook's a little bit harder because people aren't putting, their professional job title and things like that. So agree with you on that point. All right, we are getting a ton of
Awesome.
questions. So again, I apologize if we are not able to cover it. I think we'll have a couple more minutes. So if you do have any last minute pressing questions, put them in the chat. We can always answer them after this webinar is over. But let's see if we can get through a couple other ones. So how would you have wanted to be told you didn't have a product marketing fit as an outside consultant or agency?
I mean, just rip I don't think I would have heard it
Mhm.
if they didn't rip the band-aid off. Like if it were soft, like I don't know if like you might think about if your customers like I I don't think I think I would have rationalized it away. I think the only way, honestly, is to just say, like, I don't believe you have product market fit. I don't believe, or I mean, or maybe soften a little bit, like, what evidence do you have that you have product market fit? And kind of interrogate. But I would channel your inner sort of like confrontational whatever, because I do think that kind of is required, and bless you if you're asking that question to tell your CEO that.
Yeah, it's a sticky situation.
Yes.
Okay, got another question coming in. So our company is only spending into Google and Meta, which, kind of are the two main players, but we're seeing little success on Meta so far. My CEO wants to prioritize programmatic in the future. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, obviously, I don't know the business, and so I want to be careful about making like absolute statements. With that caveat aside, programmatic display rarely works as a direct response channel. That is true, and especially if you're not finding success in Meta, I don't think that's going to work. To be clear, again, without knowing it, like there could be extenuating circumstances or unique qualities about the business, but um, I would I would argue against that and or lean on third parties if you feel like that will hurt your credibility internally.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, we're gonna get through one more question, and like I said, we'll answer everything. We'll try to answer everything else after the webinar is over. So I know the focus on today's webinar is on paid channels, but I'm curious which owned or organic channels you'd recommend considering in today's landscape.
It's a good question, and I'll give a brief answer. Um, when over the last couple of years, as there's sort of been this, I mean, the headlines are right. It's like a shift away from growth at all costs. Like that's the headline: growth at all costs. I would like to think we actually weren't doing growth at all costs, but in this environment over the last couple of years that where I think we're now emerging from, there was a lot of focus back on SEO, which is great if sort of the criteria, some key criteria is met for your business, like it's national in reach. There is meaningful search keywords that you can credibly address. The competitive landscape is not such that all of first page has a 90, domain authority. Like all of that criteria was true 3 years ago. It was true 2 years ago, true 1 year ago. but it's gotten a lot more focus in recent years. I think now that's sort of also being questioned with AI, like, is that going to persist and last? But I think, let's say SEO is a big one. People talk about reinvesting in email. If you look at email as a growth lever, I say, well, that's foolish. Like, your own list is only so big. But I do think it's really wise to try to get as much possible LTV out of existing customers. And I think that's really a smart initiative that is not disassociated with channel diversification, because as you can get LTVs higher, then your CAC thresholds can go up, and channels that would not have previously worked, or you could not have gotten your CFO to get, to buy in on, now you can, and now they will work. And so I think that's sort of the interplay between lifecycle and acquisition that, really comes into focus with channel diversification. So I'll hit those two. PR, okay, maybe a third. PR, can be good for awareness, can drive temporary spikes, not a great, consistent lever. A lot of PR firms are moving into affiliate. I would be very cautious, or just vet that very thoroughly, because it is a really different skill set. But a lot of PR firms are trying to figure out a sort of new business model, and that's one of the key directions they're going.
Great. Thank you, Tyler, for covering all of that. I know we only had a few minutes, but we appreciate it. And like I said, I know a few questions are still coming in. Feel free, still put them in, and we'll go through them and review them and try to answer them after this is over. All right, we have one more poll question. We just want to get your feedback on how you thought this webinar went. So in a moment, you'll see quick poll. So just on a scale of 1 to 10, let us know how you'd rate this session, with 10 being the highest. And while we're up there, I'll leave this running for a little bit. If you do want to reach out to Tyler after this webinar is over, his contact information is up on the screen, as well as our website information if you want to fill out a quick form, and we'll get back to you shortly. And I did mention before, this is part 1 of 2 of our channel diversification webinars. So we are hosting another webinar with Katie Freeberg on our team on next Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. So you can use that QR code up on your screen to register, and we'll include a link in our follow-up comms as well.
And Amanda,
yeah, go for it.
Sorry, one follow-up question. So that webinar, that's digging into a handful of these channels that we've talked about, right? Like really doing a deep dive.
Exactly. So we're going to be covering kind of 5 specific channels. So we're going to be covering Amazon, TikTok, affiliate marketing, LinkedIn. There's one more I'm missing. Podcast. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have 5 of our kind of GMs on our team leading each of those sessions. So it's basically kind of 5 mini webinars in one. So it'd be great for you to join, especially if you are considering any of those specific channels.
Awesome.
Cool. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you so much, Tyler, for walking through really how to make the case for channel diversification. And for those who are asking, in the Q&A, we will be sharing a link to the recording after the webinar is over. So look out for that in your inbox by tomorrow afternoon. Thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.